Throughout most of its millennia-long history, the Republic maintained a centrally controlled fleet, as we see in their various wars with the Sith, the Mandalorians, the TNEs, and other enemies throughout galactic history. But by the time we get to the prequels, we see that the Republic doesn't have this anymore. So how did that happen, and what did the Republic's military actually look like in the period leading up to the Clone Wars? Following the final war with the Sith, called the New Sith Wars 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Republic's Jedi-led army and fleet were disbanded, and a set of reforms called the Rouson Reformation were put in place by Supreme Chancellor Tarsis Valorum. These reforms had many wide-reaching changes, among them establishing the rules for how the military would work for the Republic, and what local defense forces would look like until the Military Creation Act and the Clone Wars. The lack of a true standing army didn't mean the Republic or the galaxy as a whole were actually defenseless. There was a massive amount of military hardware built up in this period, boiling over with regional rivalries to be unleashed in the Clone Wars. The Republic maintained essentially a police force in the form of the judicial forces, while responsibility for most defense was placed on planets themselves, systems, sectors, or other local governments who now had to build or buy their own fleets. The Essential Guide to Warfare marks a distinction between planetary security forces and larger system and sector forces, so it wasn't quite an exact two-tier system. There could be different levels of defense organization, and how planets wanted to work together on this would have been up to them to some extent. Immediately following the reforms, this likely meant that assets held by the Republic military were sold off to the local systems, getting them a head start and offloading the burden of maintaining these vessels. Planetary security forces had always been a thing, but they used to be much more limited and seen as auxiliary forces at best. In these early days, we don't know too much about the ship types used by these groups, whether the judicials or the planetary security forces, but we do have at least some indications. Some ships, or at least their designs, like the Oryx Starfighter and Hammerhead Cruiser from the War with Revan Sith, were still used by the end of the New Sith War and beyond, making them likely candidates for backwater defense forces which couldn't afford much better. The Invincible-class dreadnought, which was already in service for thousands of years by this point, was maintained in these local defense forces as well, and then even in other later militaries, like that of the Corporate Sector Authority in the time of the Empire. And again, these are ships that were probably present in some form in both the PSFs and the judicial forces. We do know that the first leader of the judicials was a veteran of the final battle of the New Sith Wars, the Battle of Rouson, named Loon Bangir. This arrangement, with more responsibility for planetary defense forces, did include the seeds for more powerful planets to find yet another way to exploit the less powerful, and to increase economic disparity between the systems. Core planets, especially core shipyards, were both the least likely to be attacked, and had the greatest proportion of major shipyards, while the outlying systems had smaller and poorer navies, despite the greater potential threats against them. But despite the capacity of planets with long-standing shipyards like Rendili and Foros to build massive ships, there were limitations on the power and speed of planetary security forces. The PSFs, which grew in prestige over the centuries, balked at these restrictions, but they did often find their own ways around them, and the ships and fleets of the PSFs became essentially status symbols for a lot of these powerful systems. Ship classes like the Praetor 1, Procurator, and Mandator made by Kuat, which don't actually have official images, some using visuals from the Empire at War expanded mods, were quite large, but had very limited hyperdrives and were limited in how well armed they could be. So they were effectively large chunks of impressive durasteel. The caveat was that if hostilities did break out, they could generally just be upgraded and up-armed pretty quickly, as was done in the Clone Wars. By the time of the Clone Wars, there were 7 of these 8,000-meter-long Mandators in different sector defense forces. Kuat itself kept 3, while other important areas or planets in the core like Azure, Ixtlar, Alsakan, and Humberine, which was itself a colony world of Kuat, had one as well. Some other PSFs, while they couldn't afford something quite so big as a Mandator, were still able to become significant symbols of prestige. The mid-rim planet of Lantilles is one example here, as are the Greater Ploriad Wardens, and many of these PSFs started to find new ways to work together, cooperation which only grew from retreats on planets like Coruscant, which were kind of social events where either members or leaders within the PSFs would come together and discuss different ways to integrate their operations. One result of this was the revitalization of the Anaxis War College as somewhere that members of the PSF could go to get trained. It had existed before as a key institution of the Republic military, but it had fallen by the wayside. But while it was now growing, the Coruscant Judicial Academy was, quote, mocked as a factory for court officers who got to fly, and whose students probably didn't even like this video or subscribe for more. But despite this less than stellar reputation, at least in the early days, the judicial forces were effective and well respected, something that kind of declined over time. The end of the New Sith Wars were followed by the Unification Wars, bringing former Sith worlds back into the Republic and achieving notable victories at Vondark, Darinba, and the Kleena Marches. Over the next few centuries, the Judicials also fought the Mandalorians in 738, they fought an unnamed enemy in the Black Delve in the 690s, and in the Utor Shock of 602 BBY, though aside from the Mandalorians and the Mandalorian Excision, little to nothing is known about any of these events. While these victories are primarily ascribed to the judicial forces, they would have also helped to grow the reputation of the PSF, since often the PSFs were called upon to cooperate with the judicial forces. The right or expectation to maintain their own defense forces was expanded from local governments into megacorporations and associations like the Trade Federation, which slowly expanded into its own kind of regional government. The Trade Federation's Trade Defense Force grew significantly in response to the need for protection against pirates, which also evolved into time into the Trade Federation using that military to enforce their aims on local populations. Ships like the Captor class and the Lucrehulk became important parts of their fleets. Lucrehulks, already quite large and reasonably well armed within the constraints of Rouson, were up-armed even more with the Clone Wars, being outfitted and fielded as battleships in their own right, something that is similar to what happened with the Praetor and Mandator up-armings during the Clone Wars. As the prestige of the PSFs grew, some within the Republic wanted to properly re-establish a Central Republic military. Ranulf Tarkin of Ariadu established the Outlands Region Security Force, or ORSF, in 57 BBY as another private military in the Seswana sector to act as a hopeful baseline for this, becoming a crucial part in helping the judicial forces win in the Stark Hyperspace War, a fight between the Jedi and judicial forces on one side, and a pirate commercial combine led by Yako Stark and funded by the Trade Federation on the other, which was, like so many of these types of conflicts, spurred on by Palpatine and the Sith in the background. Around this time, small Corellian ships like the light assault cruisers and other consular class variants were quite popular in the judicial forces and in planetary security forces, but the dreadnought heavy cruiser of Rendili was also starting to gain traction, a ship which would be a mainstay in most galactic militaries for the next century. A large fleet of them were being put together for the Republic, called the Katana Fleet. Many of these were heavily automated to cut down on the massive crew requirements that dreadnoughts typically had, but when a virus broke out among the crew who were required, the ships were all slaved together and then lost in hyperspace, disappearing for several decades before re-emerging in the campaign by Grand Admiral Thrawn. Ranulf Tarkin may have been unsuccessful in urging the creation of a military in the short term, but his militarist faction slowly did gain traction. When the Republic voted to create a new military and the Clone Wars ultimately broke out, while a lot of the Grand Army of the Republic was either new clones or new ships like the Venator and Acclamators made in secret before the war, the planetary security forces were also mostly nationalized, and it was they rather than the Judicials who became the basis for the core command structure of the Republic and then Imperial Navy, bringing a core focus flavor into these new institutions. The Judicials were certainly part of that, but they had fallen so much by the wayside compared to the massively expanded planetary security forces that their influence couldn't really hope to compete. And those planetary security forces, it's worth noting, fought on both sides of the war. It probably wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that by the time the Clone Wars started with so much local military hardware, the galaxy was more armed than it ever had been or even would be. A big factor in why the Clone Wars were so devastating across the galaxy. That's going to do it for our look at the Republic military for today. Thanks for watching, remember to leave a like and subscribe if you have enjoyed the video, and also let me know in the comments if there's any other topics you'd want to see covered in the future. All of those things really help the channel grow. Special thanks as well to all the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now for their support, which makes the channel possible.